It's really exciting for me to give this presentation to so many people who are so enthusiastic about LA history. So here are photos of some of my work. As Leonard said, I write custom commissioned books for homeowners. And on the left are a few of them. I have a great graphic designer who designs all my books, and the interior pages are what you see in the middle. And I just print a few copies for the homeowner. So they're not sold, they're just for the owner. And they're either commissioned by the owner themselves or by people to give as gifts. And I do houses both in LA and outside of LA. I also do these clamshell boxes that are filled with historic material about the house, old photos, copies of plans. And in addition to working with homeowners, I work with real estate brokers, architects, and interior designers, landscape designers. When they're working on an historic home, they'll hire me to help them find photos when they want to bring the house back to the way it originally looked. On the right are some architectural plans for the David Selznick house. And then in the center is a mid-century modern house where the owners hired me. They just bought it and they wanted to bring the house back to the way it looked in 1959. And on the left, some real estate brokers hired me when they were selling this house on Cahuenga Terrace. It's a street right near the Hollywood Bowl. And it turns out the house was built as a demonstration of the wonders of electricity. And there was an article about the house in this Journal of Electricity from 1924. People often ask me where I find all the material. Here are some of my favorite sources. Fan magazines from Hollywood's golden era are terrific sources. Movie stars often gave interviews and did publicity photos at their house, which you don't see as much of today. So that's a terrific source. An Architectural Digest has been published since the 20s. So that's one of my favorites. And then I go on the library, archives, newspapers. I always contact the old owners of the house or their relatives. And I really just scour the earth looking for material. If you'd like to read about my work, it's been written about on these various websites. And so you can go to my homepage at lahousehistories.com, and there's links to all of these. So our story today begins with Louis B. Mayer. And as many of you know, he was the head of MGM for 27 years, from 1924 to 1951. And during that period, it was considered the greatest studio in Hollywood. On the left is Louis B. Mayer with Shirley Temple, Judy Garland, and Mickey Rooney. And in the center is Louis B. Mayer and his wife, Margaret, and their two daughters. So Edie is on the left and Irene is on the right. That's them in front of the White House in 1930. And they both got married within 6 weeks of one another. So Edie married Bill Goetz and Irene married David Selznick. And David Selznick was the producer of Gone with the Wind. That's him with Vivian Leigh at the Oscar ceremony that year. And he's the only producer to ever win Best Picture awards back-to-back in subsequent years. So he won for Gone with the Wind, and then the following year he won for Rebecca, and that's Joan Fontaine and Alfred Hitchcock with him in 1941. And Bill Goetz, who married the other Louis B. Mayer daughter, was a founder of International Pictures, which merged with 20th Century Fox, or rather 20th Century Pictures, which merged with Fox Films, and that formed 20th Century Fox. And then he was a partner in International Pictures later, and then Universal bought it and it became Universal International. And that's Bill Goetz at the bottom there with his studio stars at the time. So the wedding gift from Louis B. Mayer to his two daughters, who got married within 6 weeks of one another, was a new house. And not just the land, but the building of the house and all the money to furnish it. So this is where Irene Selznick bought. That's the Beverly Hills Hotel in the center. And the red mark on the left is where she bought the land. And they bought 2.2 acres in 1932 for $12,000. This is what the land looked like. It was right across the street from Charlie Chaplin's house. Fred Astaire would live there a few years later. He would build a house. And up the street on Summit Drive was Pickfair, Mary Pickford and Douglas Fairbanks' famous house. And on the right, you see the Virginia Robinson Gardens, which you can still visit today. That was supposed to be the first house built north of Sunset in Beverly Hills. So their house was built in 1934 by the architect Roland Coate. It cost $75,000 to build. And I wrote a book about this house. And I contacted Danny Selznick. That's Danny on the left in that photo. And his brother and Irene and David O. Selznick, they're standing in front of the house. And this house, probably more than almost any other house in LA, has been owned by just an incredible array of famous people and Hollywood celebrities. So when David and Irene got a divorce, Irene sold the house, but before she sold it, she rented it to Cary Grant and Katharine Hepburn. And then she sold it to a Doheny. Sammy Davis Jr. lived there, and other famous people through the years. And I met Danny. He's in his 80s now, and he actually took us to the house and gave the owners and I just an incredible tour of what it was like to grow up there in the 30s and 40s. Here's the living room. And Danny pointed out that white arrow on the left. That was where David O. Selznick kept his Oscars for Rebecca and Gone with the Wind. And on the right was the screening room. And every Sunday night, they had movie night starting at 5. And he pointed out the seats where Katharine Hepburn, Spencer Tracy, and Cary Grant would sit. And the screen actually came up from the floor. So the arrow on that side points to that table, and they would move the table and the screen would come up from the basement. And this is where David O. Selznick would screen dailies from his movies, or screen movies himself. And apparently he would stay up late at night and he would blast the sound, and it would bother the neighbors so much that they actually signed a petition to have him stop. And so what they did is they put fabric over the walls. So this photo on the right shows the walls before the neighbors complained, and they lined it with fabric. The landscaping on the house was designed by a famous landscape designer named Florence Yock. She was hired late in the process, and so she took this photo and then drew the plants in. And the house still looks very much the same today. This is the backyard. That's Louis B. Mayer and Danny and his brother Jeffrey. And on the left, that's Danny with David and David's mother. And they would have a cameraman from the studio come over and do their family films. So that's a studio camera that they brought to shoot their family films. And Danny actually showed us and the owners some amazing films from the house. Florence Yock did such a great job at the house that David O. Selznick hired her to do Gone with the Wind. And she landscaped Tara She didn't do the entire film, and Tar was set up at the back lot in Culver City. And so she went to Georgia to study the plant life there, and then went back to LA and tried to recreate that look on the set. And that's David O. Selznick, Louis B. Mayer, and Clark Gable signing the contract for Gone with the Wind. This is Louis B. Mayer's other daughter, Edie. Edie and Bill Goetz bought their house in 1947. So with their wedding present from Louis B. Mayer, they built a house in Bel Air, and then they later bought this house in 1947, and they owned it for 43 years. The house was originally built in 1938. The architect was Gordon Kaufman, who did the Greystone Mansion. And it was built by an heir to a Michigan manufacturing fortune named Eugene and Winfred Hill Smith. These photos are from Architectural Digest in 1940. And I got in touch with their granddaughter, who sent me photos of the house under construction. And she also sent me that bathroom towel in the center, and it's embroidered with her grandmother's name for the house. So the grandmother was named Winifred, so she named the house Winwood. And that's Winwood embroidered in her handwriting on the towel. On the right is Ann Miller. So the Hill Smiths sold the house to Ann Miller and her new husband. Ann Miller actually dated Louis B. Mayer when she was 20 and he was 60. And then Ann got married, and they were married for less than a year, and they sold the house to the Goetzes. This is the front of the house. That's Edie Goetz's chauffeur-driven Rolls Royce on the right. She never drove herself. Here's Bill and Edie in the library. The whole house was done by Billy Haynes, who is the legendary interior designer who really defined the Hollywood Regency style. And from the 1930s to the 70s, he did the LA homes of a who's who of Hollywood moguls, stars, and business executives. And he has a connection to Louis B. Mayer in that he started out as a silent movie star at MGM. And in 1933, Louis B. Mayer gave him an ultimatum to either give up his boyfriend and marry a woman in a sham lavender marriage, or if he didn't, Mayer would cancel his MGM contract. And Haynes chose to leave MGM, and he gave up his acting career to be with his boyfriend, and they were together for the next 47 years. And they lived as Hollywood's first openly gay couple. Here's the living room. Billy Haynes designed practically every piece of furniture in the house except for two pieces. At the bottom left, this was the screening room. And so that panel in the back with the three paintings on it would lift up. That's the photo at the bottom right. And then the screen would lower on the opposite end of the living room, and they would have movie nights. There was a projector in a little room right behind there. And Edie's favorite seat was on the far left next to the lamp by the window, and she would call the projectionist and push a button, and the movie would start. The screen would automatically come down, the shades would close, and they had a custom fanfare that was composed by a Hollywood composer start. That was sort of their movie fanfare. So the top picture is the Hill Smith design when the house appeared in Architectural Digest. And then at the bottom are Bill and Edie Goetz. And then 2017, when the house was sold, this is the staged house. The Goetzes were incredibly famous for their art collection. Out of all the Hollywood figures since the beginning of Hollywood, there were a few big art collectors, and the Goetzes were one of them. They had nearly 70 Impressionist paintings. And when Edie died in 1988, 28 of those works were auctioned by Christie's, and it set a record at the time, $85 million, which was the highest sale ever from a single seller at an auction. That's the entryway to the house on the right, and that's one of the two pieces of furniture that Billy Haynes did not design, that Ming table. And you can see some of their art here. They had a Degas ballerina sculpture, which all the guests would often touch the skirt and the ribbon in the hair, and they actually wound up putting a glass cover over it because people were touching it too much. They also owned a famous Van Gogh self-portrait, but ever since Bill bought it in the 1940s, it was disputed whether or not it was actually painted by Van Gogh. So at the Christie's auction, Christie's actually didn't auction it because they couldn't prove that it was a Van Gogh. And the Van Gogh on the right, or the Picasso on the right rather, was the highest sale at the auction. And that's Marilyn Monroe with that painting and with the Degas. She came over to the house in 1956 with the director of Bus Stop, and he took about a dozen photos of her standing in front of various works at the house. The Goetzes were great friends with Frank Sinatra. And when Frank got married in 1966 to Mia Farrow, he was 50 and she was 21. And they got married in Las Vegas. So they flew to Las Vegas and had their little ceremony in a hotel room at the Sands. And Bill and Edie were the matron of honor and best man. And then they flew back to LA and had the wedding party at the Goetz house. And there are about a dozen or so of these just amazing photos of the wedding party. And Mia and Frank were only married for 13 months. And he had his lawyer serve her with divorce papers while she was filming Rosemary's Baby. You can see on the right some people smoking. There were actually a dozen cigarette boxes in that room alone. And so many people smoked for so many decades that it actually discolored the paintings. And so this blue Picasso turned a little green, and Christie's actually had to restore it to bring back the original color. This is one of my favorite photos from the party. That's Frank and Mia. And if you look closely, Mia's holding a cigarette and a banana peel. And in the back, in the hallway, that glass case is where the Degas ballerina was. On the right is the library, and that's Rosalind Russell being introduced to Mia's sister, Prudence Farrow. And Mia and Prudence are actually in that photo at the bottom. After she got divorced and after the success of Rosemary's Baby, she wanted to take time off. And so she went to India with her sister and brother to take lessons in transcendental meditation from the guru who invented TM. And the Beatles were there also. And the story goes that Prudence would always be in her room meditating when the Beatles wanted to just hang out. And so they wrote the song Dear Prudence as an ode to her. And Prudence Farrow teaches transcendental meditation today in Florida. That's Edie in the library and the disputed Van Gogh. And on the right is Mia sitting on the lap of Richard Attenborough with Dean Martin standing, Frank, Jeannie Martin, and George Jacobs, who's Frank's valet. Here's the dining room. And like Pickfair was in the 1920s, this house was the epicenter of Hollywood social life for more than 20 years. From the late 1940s to the 60s, this house was the place to be, and virtually every major actor, director, and producer would come to the house for dinner. Edie would sit at the head of the table at the left, underneath that Degas ballerina painting, and they would have a full-time staff of 8 who would serve dinner. And they had a full-time French chef and the best butlers in Hollywood, people said, and entertaining became Edie's career. And for more than 40 years, Edie kept hostess notebooks of all of her dinners, and she would write down the name of all the guests who came, the food that was served, and if they showed a movie afterwards, she would write down the name of the movie. And I contacted her grandkids, and they had all of her notebooks. And so these are 2 of them, one from 1975 and one from 1948 on the right. And you can see the just the incredible list of names of the Hollywood people that came to their dinners. Edie's handwriting on the right is a little hard to read, so I put in the names in the brown lettering. And take a look at the menu on the right, and then compare that to the menu on the left. And that's kind of fun to see. I wrote an article about Edie and her entertaining for The Hollywood Reporter last year, and there's a link to the article on my website. This was the second house that I wrote about, Shirley Temple. She was born in Santa Monica on 24th Street in 1928, about 2 blocks north of Wilshire. And she made her first short film when she was only 3 years old. And at the age of 5, she signed her first contract at Fox. And at the time she signed it, Bill Goetz was an executive there. So as she gets to become a bigger star, the family upgrades her houses. So in 1934, they bought the house at the bottom in Santa Monica. That's on 19th Street, right near the Brentwood Country Mart. And by 1935, when she's 7 years old, that's the photo of her on the left, she was the most popular movie star in the world, and she was getting 60,000 fan letters a month. And fans would come outside of her house. And at the time, the Lindbergh kidnapping had happened, and Charles Lindbergh's baby was killed. And so Shirley's parents are concerned about her safety. So they start looking for a house. That's Louis B. Mayer and Shirley on the right, and then David O. Selznick and Shirley at Shirley's high school graduation from Westlake. And so they were living in Santa Monica, and they bought in Brentwood. They bought in 1935, 8 years after this aerial photo of Brentwood. They bought 3 acres where that white square is, and it's right across from the street from today's Paul Revere Middle School. Then it was the Riviera Country Club polo field and equestrian center. This is the house that Shirley's family built. The architect was John Byers. It was a 5,000 square foot English Normandy house. And it was just an incredible place for a little kid to grow up. So Sunset is at the bottom and Rockingham is at the top. You might remember that street from O.J. Simpson, who lived about a block up. The house is on the right. And here's the view from Rockingham down to Sunset. It's the house on the left. So there was a riding ring. Shirley had 2 horses in her barn, and she would ride the horse across Sunset to the Riviera polo fields. There was a carousel, a pool, a badminton court, and her parents built her a full-size playhouse in 1940 when she was 12. This is the backyard. She had a 150-foot roller coaster, which is the length of 2 tennis courts. That was given to her as a birthday gift. Then there was a famous glass brick playhouse that was built by Owens Corning as a publicity tool to promote glass bricks. And that's Shirley in the pool. There's the barn with her horses. And that's Shirley in the top standing in the shorts. Here's her bedroom. And the main house was purchased in 1951. And Shirley's parents moved into the playhouse. And in 1956, the person who had bought it from the Temples put the house up for sale, 1.5 acres for $120,000, and no one bought it. And so it was too big. So the owner split the house in half. And so that's where the white circle is. That's what he cut out. And now 3 people live in Shirley's former house. So in one half of the main house, that's number 1. The other half is 2. And then the former playhouse is number 3. And 4 and 5 are new houses. That's where the barn and riding ring used to be. Here's our last house in Holmby Hills. This house was built in 1935. It's right across the canyon from the Goetz's house. And Frank Sinatra bought it in 1948. The 5th owner of this house was the son of the couple on the left. That's Ned McLean Jr. On the right when he got married in 1938, and his parents on the left. His parents owned the Washington Post, and they, McLean, Virginia, is named after their father. And they were the last private owner of the Hope Diamond. Ned Sr. on the left bought it in 1911 from Cartier for $180,000. And it's a 45 karat diamond that's at the Smithsonian today. And it's been there for over 60 years. And the last time it was insured in 2009, it was reportedly valued at $250 million. And the story goes that whoever owns the Hope Diamond is cursed, and all sorts of terrible things happen to the McLeans. And it's a fun read if you Google Hope Diamond and read about the McLeans. But the son, Ned Jr. on the right, moved into the house. And then he got divorced, and his second wife, Gloria Hattrick, they got divorced 9 months after buying the house. And she gets the house in the divorce and sells it to Frank Sinatra in 1948. And a year later, she marries Jimmy Stewart. And that's Jimmy and Gloria when they got married in Beverly Hills in 1949. And they stayed together for the next 44 years. That's Frank at the house. He bought it in 1948 for $130,000. They moved from the Valley. That's Frank and his family. So Nancy is on the left. They called her Little Nancy, and then Big Nancy was Frank's wife. that's Tina, and then Frank Jr. So there were two juniors, Nancy and Frank Jr. And they're sitting in that corner on the seat cushion in the back. The pool is on the right, and those steps are where Frank and his kids are sitting. Across the street was Walt Disney's home, and Frank Sinatra's kids would go over to the house and ride Walt Disney's famous train. That's Walt on the front of the train with his two daughters behind him. And Walt was fascinated with trains ever since he was a kid growing up in Missouri. And he created a 1/8 scale steam-powered train in his backyard. And it was a 5-acre property right across from the Sinatra house. And it had a half-mile long railroad. He called it the Carrollwood Pacific Railroad because the street was Carrollwood. And he operated the railroad from 1950 to 1953 when a young girl was burned by the steam. And he started focusing on Disneyland, which opened 2 years later. And the engine that he's riding on was actually the model for the train at Disneyland, which is the photo in that corner. This is a model at the Disney Family Museum in San Francisco, which is an incredible museum. And this is a working model of the railroad. And the house was in the back, and you see the train tracks that went all around the house. There was a tunnel, and the Disney family owned the house from 1949 to 1997. And there's great videos of the train in action on YouTube. If you search for Carrollwood Pacific on YouTube, you can see the videos. And the red barn there is actually at Griffith Park. The Disney family donated it to Griffith Park, and that's where the railroad is at Griffith Park, and they display a lot of items from Disney's railroad in the barn. So 1 year after Frank bought the house, he started having an affair with Ava Gardner, and Frank left his wife and 3 kids, which caused a media sensation at the time. And he married Ava in 1951, and they were together until 1957. And Nancy and the kids stay at the house until 1961. And in 1961, they sold it to Charles Thornton and his wife, Flora, who would own it for the next 49 years. He was the co-founder of Litton Industries, which was the defense contractor, and they also had all sorts of other divisions. It was a conglomerate. They owned Royal Typewriters, Stouffer's Frozen Foods, Litton microwave ovens. And Flora was a great philanthropist. So the USC School of Music is named the Flora Thornton School of Music. And after she passed away, the house was sold to Brad Gray and his wife. He was the CEO of Paramount for 12 years. And Brad and his wife bought it in 2010, and they tore it down and built a modern house, which is this. And then he died of cancer several months after he completed the house. And the house was sold in 2018. Here's an aerial of the house with Century City in the background and the Wilshire Corridor. Here's a great aerial that shows some of these houses. So this is 35 years ago in 1985. The Sinatra house is at the bottom. Clark Gable and Carole Lombard were once across the street. Barbra Streisand lived across the street. And Walt Disney's house is on the right. And you can actually see the former path of the tracks, those dirt, the circular dirt path right near the D in Disney. That's the former Carrollwood Pacific. And the Goetz house was at the top. And on the right is the same view today. And there's only two houses that are original, the Goetz house and the house in the bottom left, which I'm now writing about, which was built by Constance Bennett. And then she sold it to Loretta Young. And just imagine all the stories that happened at these houses from the 1920s through today. So thank you to Leonard and the LA City Historical Society for inviting me to do this, and all of you for joining us today. If you live in an older home or know someone who does in LA or anywhere, and you're curious about its history, don't hesitate to get in touch. And if anyone has questions, I'm happy to answer and go back to any of the slides that you'd like to.
Let's look at the questions here. The first one is from Edward. Hi, David. Are you familiar with Harold Levitt, who built some beautiful homes in Beverly Hills, and what he was known for? Art Deco, question mark.
Yeah, I've never researched his houses, but I know that he did a lot of houses in Truesdale. And I love that neighborhood, and I love mid-century houses, but I haven't done a book about him yet.
Have you done any research on Doheny?
Yeah, actually, I wrote a book about the Knoll, which was built by Lucy Doheny Batson in the 1940s. And as part of that book, I researched the Dohenys, and that was the Marvin Davis mansion that was also once owned by the Italian producer who did King Kong. And so as part of that house, I researched the Dohenys, and Greystone was Gordon Kaufman, who did the Goetz house.
And then we have a greeting from Mark here. Great job, David, and I'm impressed with some of the rare images that you found. And Mark Wanamaker is actually previous president of the LA City Historical Society, I believe, and he is also in charge. Oh, I'm blanking out here. Sorry, Mark. Bison Archives. Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, Mark. I met Mark when I started doing this, and he's been a terrific resource, and his knowledge of LA history and old Hollywood is just unparalleled.
And Cindy is asking, where do you do your research?
A lot of it's on the internet, but then I get books. So I basically try to find every book that was ever written about one of the owners and look for material in there about the house. Archives, museums, the archives of the architects are often kept at institutions, and there'll be old photos. Photo archives, people like Mark Wanamaker, and then old magazines, old newspapers. And in old Hollywood, they actually would publicize the address of the stars. So the fan magazines would run articles with the names and addresses, the street addresses of the stars, which is pretty remarkable. And there's great stuff in the old fan magazines.
Has there been any historic homes that you have had trouble researching, like dead ends or just no documentation available?
Yeah, so often people will contact me and they'll want to do a book about their house, and there's simply not enough material that I can find. So It helps if the older the house is, the more famous the people who live there. And often I just can't find material, or if someone has a really common name. So I'll get the chain of title on the house, the list of all the owners from the time the house was built until today. And if the person has a unique name, it's a lot easier to find them in old newspaper articles and records. But if they have a super common name, it's really hard. So so I've definitely run up on dead ends like that. But when it works, it works great. And the book I wrote about the Goetz house was 400 pages. And then I've done a 20-page brochure for someone's house. So it totally varies, and I can often just simply find photos of a house in a couple hours. So it all depends on what the client wants and how famous the house was.
Is there an estate, house, mansion from glamorous old Hollywood that has been torn down and that you wish still existed? If so, which ones?
Well, one of my favorite houses is the E.L. Cord house. So Cord Automobiles was a luxury auto brand in the 30s, and Cord had this amazing Paul Williams mansion in Beverly Hills off Sunset near Doheny, and it was a huge estate, and that was demolished. And I've seen some photos of that look amazing. And one of my favorite houses is the Harold Lloyd estate, and that the house is still there, but the grounds have all been subdivided. And if you Google that house, you can see old aerial photos of the gardens, which are just amazing. He had a river where they would take a boat down. He had a 9-acre golf course, and it was right next door to Jack Warner's house, who also had a 9-acre golf course, or a 9-hole golf course. And so people playing golf there would golf at each of their houses and combine the holes to make 18. And the landscaping there is just amazing. So I would have loved to have seen that.
Do you have any interest in Palm Springs? Lots of history there for sure.
Yeah, when I was a kid growing up in LA, I would go to Palm Springs in the winter and for just a weekend or so. And I would love to do work on some of the mid-century modern houses there. And the Modernism Week, I've never been, but I've heard it's amazing, and I'd love to go.
So in your work, do you focus mostly on the greater Los Angeles area, or like in this case, you wouldn't mind doing something in Palm Springs, or kind of offering these services in all of Southern California, or?
Yeah, I focus on the West Side because that's where I live and that's where I know people. But I've done houses elsewhere, and I could do the work really anywhere in the US. And people do this also in England or London, and that would be scary to me because those houses are hundreds of years old. So I've only gone back to houses that were built in the teens.
I think that's it. Did you have any more comments yourself, David, that you want to make, or?
No, that sounds great. I really appreciate everyone coming and sharing your enthusiasm, and I'm just so grateful that the Historical Society exists, and there aren't enough really celebrations of LA history.